Okay, so we are at part two of our commentary, news, and views from the Nefarium on the Egyptian Museum looting and the story of Zahi Hawass, that what we're looking at is the theft of red mercury. Well, as I've mentioned, this substance has a very peculiar background. It has a specific meaning in alchemy that if you look at the alchemical texts that I examined in the Philosopher's Stone, you'll find that within alchemical texts that as you get closer and closer to the actual confection of the Philosopher's Stone, there's a sequence of colors that the alchemists talk about that emerges, excuse me, just as you get to the point that you're about able to do it. And the color that tells you that you have done so is one of two. It's either white in some cases or it's red. All right. So sometimes you'll find the alchemists referring to our philosophical mercury, and they'll do so in connection with the color red. Some will actually come out and just say, this is our red mercury. All right. So in other words, the the use by Dr. Zahi Hawass of the phrase red mercury is itself, and this is, please, an important point to understand, is itself an alchemical act, because the other thing that alchemy is attempting to do is transform consciousness. It's not only trying to make an actual material, physical philosopher's stone that's able to transmute base metals into gold. That's what everyone thinks about. That's what you and I think about when we hear about alchemy, when we hear the term alchemy. But alchemy has a much broader and a much deeper sense than just that. It means also the transformation of the soul. And ultimately, what alchemy really means is that the prime matter, the physical medium out of which everything else is made, is the real philosopher's stone. All right? So red mercury becomes a symbol for all of this. So in employing the term, this is what I find very peculiar about this news story, is because, of course, he's saying all of this in the middle of a crisis. Here we have Zahi Hawass talking about, of all things, number one, an alchemical symbol, which he's releasing into the ether, or the internet, as it were. And I think there's a chance that we're looking here at a bit of some sort of psychological operation, because that term has an alchemical reference. He's effecting, as it were, a transformation of consciousness, and he is perhaps dyeing the waters in some sort of operation to see where this meme is going to go from Egypt. And that's just pure speculation, I grant you. Now, the other thing that interests me is, as I mentioned in the first part of this, the term red mercury suggests this 1990s international nuclear terrorism scare that began in the wake of the collapse of communism, with this alleged substance that was reportedly discovered in the Soviet Union that allowed you to detonate a hydrogen bomb without having an atomic bomb as the fuse, thereby cutting down dramatically on the amount of radiation that would be released in the detonation of a hydrogen bomb. Because, of course, a hydrogen bomb is so much larger, even the smallest of them, is so much larger than a conventional atomic bomb explosion, that literally the radioactive cloud is carried all the way up into the stratosphere. In other words, those mushroom clouds that you see from hydrogen bomb explosions are much, much bigger than from an atom bomb. And that radioactivity is lifted up into the stratosphere, and then, of course, drifts much farther over an area than it would from an atomic bomb explosion. In fact, it's carried by the jet stream, so radioactivity from those things during those 1950s tests of hydrogen bombs that the United States and the Soviet Union were doing, those tests carried radioactivity from each explosion all around the world. In other words, this stuff stays in the atmosphere and it doesn't fall out for a very long time. So they're very deadly to use, of course, in any numbers. So in other words, this gave the legend of red mercury made possible, or gave the possibility, that hydrogen bombs were safer, so to speak, to use because you wouldn't have the same radioactive effects because you're dispensing with the atomic bomb that creates most of the radioactive fallout in a thermonuclear reaction. So in other words, here in the middle of all of this crisis in Egypt, we're having another little throwback of a story that just does not seem to want to die, and that's red mercury. And here's Dr. Zahi Hawass saying that in the midst of this crisis, Egyptians are trying to find this substance in mummies' mouths. All right? So, in other words, my friends, it looks to me like we're dealing here not so much with a fabricated story, but at least perhaps with an exaggerated one. That there is some aspect of this story, given the symbolism of red mercury and the background, the deep background it has not only in alchemy, but also in terms of more recent things, the nuclear scare of the 1990s, and as I mentioned in part one, it's even got a loose connection to the fluid or the substance that was used in the Nazi bell. So it has a deep, deep symbolic significance to anyone that has really studied the literature. And for Dr. Zahi Hawass, whom many people believe to be in the pocket of some sort of hidden Western elite and is their point man or front man for protecting and controlling their monopoly over Egyptian antiquities. For someone like Hawass, in the midst of this crisis, to release that little meme into the whole tense atmosphere, I think is rather telling. And that's why I think that, again, pure speculation, but that's why I think we may be looking at some sort of psychological operation here. Because, again, it doesn't seem rational to me that the Egyptians would be asking him, quote unquote, all the time about this substance in the middle of a political crisis. But let's look at the kernel of truth. If there is any truth to this story, if there was, in fact, some substance called red mercury in the mouths of those mummies, and people are attempting to loot that substance, then it raises the possibility, once again, that you have some sort of hidden hand after some sort of bit of lost technology, or perhaps they want to compare it with the results of their own modern alchemical pursuits. Who knows? But the story is extremely suspicious to me, and it's worth watching. And one final comment. Given the background of the term red mercury, its connection, its deep connection to alchemy, its deep connection to nuclear terrorism scares of the 1990s, and an even more peculiar connection to the Nazi Bell Project, given all of this stuff, it seems to me that we have to conclude that possibly behind the Egyptian museum looting, there was indeed some sort of planned effort to recover some aspect of an ancient technology. This has always been my suspicion with the Baghdad museum looting in Iraq. And this little story from Zahi Hawass himself raises my suspicion meters into the red zone. So this is going to be a story that we're going to have to watch rather carefully and hope that the situation doesn't get so out of hand in Egypt that all those priceless antiquities are somehow lost to our scrutiny or buried beneath the sands. Anyway, that will do it for this week. I may be back with more little news and views from the Nefarium later this weekend. I mentioned that I was going to do that last weekend, but I never got back to it because I've been so busy. I'm about halfway through the book I'm writing now. I have about 5 chapters left. They will be intensely technical chapters, so it will be perhaps the rest of this month and on into March before I get this book done. But it is contracted with Adventures Unlimited Press, which means I'm hoping that the book will be out no later than the autumn. I'm hoping earlier, actually. But as soon as it's at the printer, I will let everybody know what it's about. Anyway, Everyone, thank you again for your donations, for your comments, for your help, for your support, for your encouragement, and we'll talk to you next weekend, if not before. God bless.